Hi, everyone. My name is Ian Spangler. I'm the Assistant Curator for Digital and Participatory Geography here at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. You're joining us tonight for a talk entitled The Map and the Machine, Charting the Spatial Architecture of Digital Capitalism with Professor Luis Alvarez León. I apologize that I'm a little stuffy tonight, but thankfully you won't have to listen to me for much longer. Before we begin our program, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to indigenous peoples. The Massachusetts people lived for thousands of years and still live today on the Shawmut Peninsula. The metropolitan region is also home to other tribes, including Mashpee and Aquinnah-Wampanoag and the Nipmuc Nations. Copley Square sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. And the maps that are in our collections here at the Leventhal Center bear witness not only to the histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, these maps don't simply document these stories, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. So through all of our programs and interpretation, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. Tonight's talk is the first in a series of programs associated with the Leventhal Center's current exhibition, Processing Place: How Computers and Cartographers Redrew Our World. Drawing on maps and mapping tools from the early days of digital computing, the exhibition tells various stories about the human role in computer mapping. In showcasing and providing interpretive context for these cartographic objects, we hope that Processing Place demystifies the digital maps that play an important role in our everyday lives today. To see the exhibit, you can visit our gallery during normal operating hours posted on our website. Or you can explore the digital exhibition at its link online. Processing Place is dedicated to the memory of David J. Weaver, whose gifts to the Leventhal Center made the show possible. And if you'd like to help our mission to continue doing research and interpretation into these cartographic objects from the early days of geographic information systems, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the David J. Weaver GIS Research Fund. For now, I'm thrilled to hand it over to Professor Luis Alvarez León for his talk, which I'm so excited to hear, on the map in the machine. Luis Felipe Alvarez León is Associate Professor of Geography at Dartmouth College. In 2016, he completed his PhD in geography at the University of California, Los Angeles, and was presented with the Best Dissertation Award by the AAG Economics Geography Specialty Group. From 2016 to 2018, he was a postdoctoral scholar at the Sol Price Center for Social Innovation, and in 2018, he was visiting assistant professor of urban and economic geography at Clark University. His work focuses on the political economy of geospatial data, media, and technologies. And he's currently researching the geographies of autonomous vehicles and the changing political economy of remote sensing. He is the author of a new book, The Map and the Machine: Charting the Spatial Architecture of Digital Capitalism, which we'll have the pleasure of hearing more about in just a few moments. We'll have some time at the end of the program for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions at any point, you can get in the queue by posting into the comments section of whatever platform you're using to watch. Without further ado, Luis, take it away.
Thank you, Ian. It's really a pleasure to be back here at the Leventhal Center and at the Boston Public Library, and particularly part of this Processing Place exhibit. So thank you also to Kiana, Garrett, and everyone else who made this possible. Just to kick things off, The Map and the Machine, as Ian mentioned, is a book that just came out with University of California Press. So I'm very happy to share a version of this talk here with you. And really, what this book is about is, as its subtitle suggests, is really exploring the role of spatial data and spatial technologies in configuring something that we can recognize today as a new form of capitalism, which is digital capitalism. So I'll go over the general structure of the talk first, and before diving in, I'll first set the scene with the, let's say, some general considerations, and then really I'm going to walk through the chapter structure of the book, particularly focusing on the story of how MapQuest became Google Street View and why that matters to understand the digital economy or digital capitalism today. Then we'll focus on the link between location as a concept, as an idea, the techniques of geolocation, and then how that influences or shapes allocation processes, allocation of economic resources, money, power, etc. Chapters 4 and 5 respectively deal with the new satellite economy or remote sensing Earth observation economy, and then changes in the transportation and mobility markets that are deeply intertwined with spatial technologies, after which I will conclude with some key takeaways. So just to set the scene here, I think three considerations are important to begin with. First, to recognize that digitization is really changing the geographic organization of the global economy. And this is really more than just an incremental, let's say, incorporation of digital technologies, but really qualitatively it gives rise to something that I've come to call, along with many other scholars, digital capitalism. One important point to really highlight is the fact that digital capitalism is not placeless. And it's not the same everywhere. So this might seem paradoxical because digital technologies often appear to be sort of almost ethereal in a way that they appear disembodied, or we don't often see the infrastructure behind them. However, digital capitalism, it is deeply embedded in particular geographic contexts, and it is thoroughly localized, and that's part of what this talk will really unearth. And then lastly, geospatial technologies are really key to creating this spatial architecture that underpins digital capitalism. They are also essential to understand how it works, and then, as I will highlight in the end, to transform it. But to start with, something that would seem very removed from the digital economy or digital capitalism are Mumbai's Dabbawalas. So Mumbai's Dabbawalas are an institution that really goes back more than 100 years in the city of Mumbai. And these are food delivery workers that essentially connect homes with workplaces. And their role is to pick up lunch boxes at the place where the food is prepared, which is usually a home, and then bring it by lunchtime, bring a hot meal to the person working at an office. And this is a quite stable and very efficient institution where the error rate is 1 in 1 million deliveries at the most. And there's been, Harvard Business School has a case study on the Dabbawalas, and they're a highly esteemed institution in Mumbai. Now, one important thing to point out is that they exist within a particular context, that in this case is a particular set of linkages between homes and offices, and even a gendered structure where, for the most part, it's the wives that cook the meals at home and the husbands who receive the meals in their offices, or the mothers cooking the meal at home and the sons receiving the meal at the offices. These are very stable networks, and the Bawalas know their pool of customers very well, and they also know the locations of where they're picking up the food and where they're delivering it on a day-by-day basis. However, Mumbai's Dabbawalas are now facing pressure from new delivery platforms. So this is we're all very familiar with them here in the U.S. Something like Uber Eats would be emblematic, but in India, other companies are making an appearance. And what's interesting here is that they are offering a different sort of locational infrastructure to the food delivery business, because it means that uh, for example, office workers who do not have someone at home who cooks for them can now order in. It also means that the restaurants from which people order, or the locations where the food is prepared, are changing, at the discretion of the customer. So these are networks that are constantly updated, and it's posing a challenge for the Dabawala economy. However, even as the Dabawalas are deeply embedded in the particular social structure of Mumbai, and it would appear that these platforms are not as embedded. Part of what this talk will endeavor to really highlight is the fact that even these new technologies, which would seem to sort of come out of nowhere and be realized just through the magic of an app, also require some deep embeddedness in particular locations, and they also have a fundamentally spatial component. To start with, and this is something I'll return in chapter 4, uh, these particular platforms are fundamentally reliant on GPS location, and this is something that can only really happen when people have their phones and they operate through the apps. So this is just one example on how the location of spatial information allows for the construction of new economies and new markets. So for this reason, I've developed the sort of the three-part conceptual framework that I use throughout the book to really examine and analyze different instances of the digital economy and how location data underpins and makes many of these digital markets possible. So the three parts of this framework are location, valuation, and marketization. So essentially, where are things situated in space, or people, or activities? How do we value them in different ways? And how do we build markets around those things? And so connecting these three elements, you'll see the fundamental role that geospatial technologies are playing in building this new form of digital capitalism. So to start with, I think an important point is to consider where all this spatial information came from that is now exists on the internet. One entry point is to trace the trajectory from MapQuest, which used to be how a lot of us would get directions in the early days of the internet, to Google Street View or Google Maps, which is today perhaps the norm for navigating our surroundings, whether by foot or driving. Uh, so in something that we'll come back to later, it's important to mention that university research and government-funded projects gave rise to what is now known as geographic information systems in the 1960s and 70s. So that can be seen as an antecedent for a lot of the online or web maps that we have today. But in the 1990s, maps and other types of geospatial data made it onto the internet. The result became known as the GeoWeb, which is a vast collection of geospatial data, maps, services, and other platforms online. However, today the GeoWeb is almost indistinguishable from really the rest of our digital environments by virtue of its success. Basically, almost every digital trace that we can think of, every form of digital data that we can think of, really has some form of geographic identifier. So to go back a little bit in history, how do we get to MapQuest? And so it's really worthwhile to think about the connection between what we think of as today as the digital economy and other information industries that preceded it. So in this case, MapQuest is an illustrative example because it started in the middle of the 19th century with a Chicago-based publisher, R.R. Donnelly and Sons, who would later become famous for publishing magazines like Life and Time. But among other things, they published road atlases. And one of those road atlases eventually made it onto a CD-ROM and then onto an early version of the internet. After spinning off into a separate company, that became MapQuest. And MapQuest was revolutionary in a sense because it really provided customizable maps. So where people would just input their origin and destination of their travel, and then the map would give them directions, which would As was the custom at the time, we would print out and then follow as we were either walking or driving. So not the most practical thing for today's standards, but quite innovative for the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, this idea really was taken to the next level, as it were, by Google, who then really realized that the map was an excellent way to organize information, nominally Google's core mission, and a way to embed all sorts of other search data that could then, of course, serve the advertising purposes for which Google gets most of their revenues. So as a result, and through a relentless process of expansion by buying a lot of different companies, so for example, Google Maps really was started by an Australian company called Where to Street, and Google developed a full-fledged geospatial ecosystem that includes, of course, Google Maps, Google Street View, which provides 360-degree virtual environments made out of stitched together photographs, and then, of course, Google Earth. So all of this really gives us a deeper integration of spatial information of different kinds, and then the rest of the information that is on the internet explicitly for the purposes of marketizing it, for advertising it, for providing more and more finely grained information about businesses, about things that are out there in the real world, and upon which the location both of the searches and the users and the providers or the advertisers is absolutely essential. So it's really worth spending a bit of time reflecting on what location is in particular, and how it's connected with these processes that are happening as we sort of navigate our search bars, or Google Street View, for example. So location as an idea can refer to various processes, for example, of finding something on the surface of the earth, locating a particular address that you're after, but it also can refer to the decision to site something in space. And so, for example, to locate the construction of a plant after a decision-making process or a consultation process, or which oftentimes makes heavy use of geographic information systems to really query and find the optimal location for things through various types of spatial analyses. And so GIS really can help us, find where things are in the first sense of location, but they're also very important in determining the location of things like infrastructure. So one important point that I want to make is that the idea of location here is deeply intertwined with digital infrastructure, not only in the sense that digital infrastructure can help us find location or make locational decisions, but that is already baked into it. So the location ideas, priorities, mental models that went into building digital infrastructures are already in many ways shaping what we can do with those infrastructures. And this is where the idea of geolocating can become helpful, because it is through processes like IP geolocation or GPS that we then incorporate location into these processes of valuation and marketization. So location, when we locate information, in other words, when we pinpoint data flows that exist in sort of electronic form, but we pinpoint them to specific locations in space, we can endow them with economic value, which can in turn help companies build new products, services, and markets. In other words, it is no accident that when you search something on Google, many of the top results that you get are for companies or providers that are within your zip code or your metropolitan area or your actual physical location. Now, a lot of this can be traced back to efforts on digitizing location in the first place, about which you can learn a lot more in the Processing Place exhibit. For now, suffice it to say that in the 1960s, this was a problem that a lot of governments were trying to tackle, and the Canadian government was really the first to crack this this task with the Canadian GIS, or the Canada Geographic Information System. And this was really a problem for the Canada Land Registry, or how to organize and classify and keep together all of the vast land holdings of the Canadian state. And this is where the process of digitizing maps and sort of aligning them together and connecting all of their attributes and allowing decision making and queries across different types of maps became really the central function of what would then be called geographic information systems. So some of these early maps were really fundamental attempts in trying to connect what was then a quite labor intensive pursuit of really translating the real world into some medium, but then making it digital and reproducible and expandable across, let's say, different realms and through new kinds of data that could be constantly imported through processes of digitization, or now, as we have in social media or other forms, these are data that are, let's say, native to digital environments. So the project of digitizing location really was happening at around the same time as we had another large state-funded infrastructural project, which was that of the internet. So born in the late 60s with ARPANET really taking off in 1969, the internet, or what became later known as the internet, was a digital network that was originally built, among other things, to respond to defense priorities. So ARPANET of course, responds to the name of Advanced Research Project Agency, which was, of course, part of the Department of Defense of the United States. Now, one of the key ideas here was that in the context of the Cold War, something like a decentralized network like ARPANET would be able to withstand and sort of reconnect itself after a nuclear attack that, let's say, for example, if the catastrophic were to occur and one or more urban centers would be taken out, this would be a more resilient way to maintain communications than something like a telephone network. So I go a little bit into this point simply to note that these locational and geographic priorities were already baked into how this network was built. And if you can see, many of those initial nodes in ARPANET, and this is already a version of the network that existed in 1984, really respond to a particular geography of research centers, universities, military contractors, and other key sites in the government and knowledge economy of the United States. So this is important for our story here because the locational decisions that sort of gave rise to the internet and how the internet sort of rolled the idea of its location and its geographic distribution would then later become, in the early 2000s, the key to unlock essentially the geographically differentiated digital markets that we have today. So this really came to the fore in a very famous court case in France, where there was a lawsuit against Yahoo because it was found that in many auction sites that were run by the company, by the search engine, there was Nazi memorabilia that was being offered. Now, while this is not illegal in the United States, in France, there are laws against that. And so it was argued in court that Yahoo was breaking French law by knowingly providing access to French users to illegal objects. Now, Yahoo's response was that they had no way of knowing who could access their auction sites. And as part of the case, an expert witness, an engineer by the name of Cyril Houry, really demonstrated that one could use the structure of the internet, in this case, IP addresses and the geographic location databases associated with them, to really pinpoint to a reasonable degree where users were located, at the very least at the city level. And now, of course, these technologies have evolved to a much greater degree of locational specificity. And so Furthermore, they pointed out that Yahoo was already doing something like that by targeting a lot of the advertisements to French users in French. So this court case went back and forth between France and the United States for many years. But really, the result, what I take away from that, is really the realization of this, the potential of this geolocation, which leads us to many of the targeted offerings that we have today, from anything like the search on your Google results and how locationally specific they are, to the fact that providers like Netflix or other content distribution platforms can tailor their offerings by looking at somebody's GPA, somebody's IP address, and then either allowing or denying access to certain content to which they have purchased the rights. So location in this case, which is baked into the infrastructure of the internet, is integral to these allocation processes of who can get what, when, where, and why. Now, another infrastructure that was laid out during the Cold War, and in this case, as a result of the space race, or rather kicking off the space race, is really satellites. Now, satellites for a long time were the near exclusive domain of states, and really only a small number of states, starting, of course, with the Soviet Union, then the United States, and other rich and developed countries. However, there have been new technological developments like miniaturization in the past decade or two that have led to the expansion of satellite capabilities to many countries, and particularly crucial, private companies. Now, many of these satellites are for communication purposes, and of course, something like Starlink has become a one of the most talked about technological developments of the recent years. But other satellites are used to remotely sense the Earth, so they capture vast amounts of information by really taking different types of either imagery or sensing of the surface of the Earth. Now, circulating in this new satellite ecosystem, which is made up of course, governments, but also private firms, NGOs, universities, many others, remotely sensed data, which was mostly the province of military intelligence or satellite or scientists for a very long time, like for example, climate scientists. This data is increasingly integrated in other aspects of digital capitalism. So this is really a new development where satellite remotely sensed data are much more available than ever and are deeply connected with other forms of, let's say, digital products and services that make up our digital economy. And so it's important to trace and really contextualize these developments, because satellites and the data they produce really are a product of particular geopolitical orders. So in many ways, the satellite launch facilities, who controls satellites, who holds the keys to either allow or disallow the circulation of certain data, is really influenced by those geopolitical orders and the strategic consequences of those technologies. So we have not really, even though a lot of these data are for, let's say, private and profit driven or market purposes, there's still an essential strategic component. And we see this, for example, with the role of Starlink in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And so this is something that really reminds us of the continuous sort of interconnection and close, let's say, relationship between the digital world and the military. So we can go more in depth into that into the question and answer period, but that we're also seeing a return to many of the military roots of both Silicon Valley and the digital economy at large. For now, suffice it to say that miniaturization has really been one of the drivers in this expansion of satellite capabilities. So we have here, for example, CubeSats, which have allowed many states to deploy satellites that didn't used to have satellites before, many of those in partnerships with other states. Like in this case, the Japanese Space Agency has been instrumental in partnering with countries, like for example, countries in Southeast Asia, to launch many of their own satellites, which gives us a new satellite ecosystem that has all sorts of make sun models, so to speak, but also that responds to very different priorities. Some of these are private, some of these are public, some of these are multinational, some of those are secret, others are for communications or for remote sensing, etc. Such that today we have about 7,500 satellites in space, and really a wider distribution of satellite capabilities than we have ever had before. So I don't expect that you can see every single thing in this chart, but what I want to draw your attention to first is the number of rows that are represented here, which are mostly the number of countries, some of which are partnerships between countries, but really there are over 100 countries with satellite capabilities. So that's a phase change from what we had 10, 20, or of course 40 or 50 years ago, where satellites were exclusive to really world superpowers. Now, of course, that geopolitical influence continues to this day because we have the US, China, the UK, Russia, and Japan at the very top, with the US having by far the most satellites, with almost 5,000 of them by this database's last count, which was in 2023. And I expect that this number will be much larger today. So what we have here is both an expansion of satellite capabilities through private and public means, but then also the endurance of certain asymmetries that have pervaded the satellite world infrastructure for a long time. Now, one of the consequences of this is the explosion in terms of commercial remote sensing platforms. So one of the most famous ones is Planet Labs, now called Planet, which has a constellation of satellites that provides near real-time imagery on any place on Earth every single day. Now, this is, of course, an amazing technological development, and part of the challenge of these new, let's say, Earth observation platforms has been to find new markets. So these technologies are there, but what has really marked the industry in the past few years is how to integrate closer and closer with the digital economy. So you can see these images a lot on news media, for example. And one of the research projects that we did here at Dartmouth was to track their use in news stories, and how a lot of these images end up in, let's say, newsrooms free of charge, in part because they are a way of circulating and showcasing these capabilities and trying to also attract customers. Now, one of the avenues in which Planet and other firms have found an integration to the digital economy is through satellite analytics. And so, for example, this is where here AI becomes particularly salient, where artificial intelligence can be used to sort through satellite images and detect patterns, or identify something that, for example, a competitor is doing. If you are a target and you want to see, the sort of average foot traffic on a Walmart on a Wednesday afternoon, then you would access something like this. So what we have here is the sort of increasing closeness between different types of infrastructures that have now become digital infrastructures, and that are sort of converging in many cases along the line of commercialization, digital products and services, each of which provides different dimensions of the spatial data in this case. So a final example of this, again, this integration is really the idea of mobility. And so particularly I'm talking about automobility, something that really shaped the construction of the 20th century and how we have come to organize our society around the car. And so, in particular, recently, two developments really, for me, are salient in this regard. So, ride hailing on the one hand, and autonomous vehicles on the other. Both of these developments represent different kinds of integration of digital spatial information for different purposes. So, on the one hand, digital ride hailing platforms rely on GPS data and digital maps, like the Google Maps that I showed you before, to create new experiences of mobility in space, where we can just see where rides are near us and hail them directly through an application. As a result, they also create new power relations, and they spark new conflicts over governance of space and mobility, which we'll go into in a moment. Autonomous vehicles, on the other hand, they also rely on the integration of different kinds of geospatial data, GPS, of course, but also LiDAR. So let's say laser radar, so to speak, high definition cameras, and others, as well as computer vision, to create real time representations of space, which they navigate autonomously, of course. And in the process, they also create new spatial relations, new conflicts, and new revenue streams, or at least that's the hope of many of the companies that are behind this. However, one point that I really do want to question is how much these innovations are actually disrupting or how much they are reinforcing the system of automobility, which is something we'll go into in a minute. So if we think of ride hailing as a reimagining of space, part of what's relevant here is how our experience of space becomes mediated through an application, which again is in turn reliant on the location, in this case, of the user and the drivers around there. So these in the proximity of the user, or at least available to pick up the user. Now, this is important because it's through this application that then the network transportation network companies like Uber, Lyft, Didi, etc., they come up with certain valuation processes, many of which are quite obscure to the user and the drivers themselves, and then allocate, how much of the payment is going to go to the drivers, how much is going to go to the company. How the surge charges work, at which times. A lot of this is decided by these new intermediaries. But then the result is, of course, this provision of new mobility services that allows for, in many ways, like a much, let's say, smoother experience of riding for many of the users, while it does have many associated frictions with it, which have been thoroughly documented. For a recent example, read the book Disrupting DC about the rise of Uber and how they developed a playbook as part of their experience in DC. But in any case, part of this reimagining of space really entails new politics in the city. So, of course, like the Dabawalas that were already there in the food delivery space and are now facing pressure from the ride hailing food delivery applications, in this case, the taxi markets are. Or the taxi services all over the world are the segment of the market that is receiving the most pressure. So really, a lot of the story of this reimagining of space that is made possible by these applications has to do with the contentious politics that emerge at street level when the taxi drivers, let's say, push back or block the rides or lobby for, let's say, for the transportation network companies to pay the same kinds of taxes or to be monitored in the same ways, etc. So this is a story that for the image here was taken in Buenos Aires, one city where these politics eventually also came to a boil, as they have done in Paris and other places. Now, another aspect of this disruption in mobility is the autonomous car, which is something that is in its nascent stages. Now, it is something that integrates many types of geospatial data, as we mentioned before, radar, LiDAR, GPS, etc., and provides the promise of mobility without the driver. So we can see this as another iteration of this digital disruption of mobility via new spatial technologies. So in many ways, it's the next step from Uber, except without the drivers. And thus, it's no accident that many of the ride-hailing companies have also been interested in automating away the drivers. Now, how much of this AV revolution is actually changing the system of automobility? So really, what I contend is that in this case, it is not actually eliminating our reliance on cars, but it is just giving us new spatial experiences, which are, let's say, increasingly digitally mediated, and in this case, where we don't even have to interact with humans, while in this case, continuing to, let's say, rely on movement via cars versus, in this case, public transportation, as an example. Now, just to zoom out from these particular examples, I want to connect these threads and really, through the ideas of location, valuation, and marketization, emphasize the point that geospatial technologies are more than just a way to represent things that are out there in the world, but they really are a key mechanism through which data is imbued with economic value, how it is transformed into commodities and assets from rides in the ride hailing business, or food delivery, or analytics that incorporate satellite data, or simply maps that contain a lot of advertising, and how all of these commodities and assets are then used to build markets of various kinds, which are then embedded in particular places. So it really depends on where this market is situated in the real world, and how it interacts with the sort of embedded and geographically specific factors, such as the urban structure, or the power of the taxi drivers, or the gendered household division of labor, in terms of how these markets are going to actually look like. So in other words, the digital economy is not the same everywhere. It is deeply geographically variegated. So these very tools, because of this geographical variegation, they allow for power relations of different kinds, such as digital surveillance, discrimination, harassment, censorship, cyber attacks, etc. So really, to shed light on how this interaction between place and geography and the digital all comes together, the LVM, location, valuation, monetization conceptual triad, can help us understand how the digital is intrinsically geographic, and how the geographic is absolutely central to how digital capitalism is built. In other words, to finish, asserting the power of place to reframe digital capitalism in geographic terms is a way to reclaim the digital and steer it towards alternative logics, values, and priorities that can better respond to how we live our daily lives, how we may want to reorganize our social and political world, and how we want to confront some of the most urgent collective challenges that lie ahead. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion, and I hope you get a chance to read the book, and I'm very happy to hear from all of you.
Luis, thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. We have a couple of questions starting to trickle in. I thought I would do a little bit of pump priming. There's so many things that that come to my mind as you walk through this sort of material history of digital maps and data, and how they have become something that's so ubiquitous in everyday life. We always here at the Map Center like to think through maps. So I'm curious, this is a very broad question, but I'm curious to hear sort of where you land on it. For you, where do cartographic objects figure into your thinking about digital capitalism? And maybe put another way, since the map is already in the machine, as you say, what is the role of maps under digital capitalism versus, for example, the spatial locational data that many times exists in the absence of a map, right? Like in your example of Netflix and the sort of geofencing applications that you might see in streaming services, or even you could think about Lyft scooters or ride sharing bikes, right? That turn off once you enter a certain area of the city. So I'm just curious to hear you reflect a little bit on that tension between the map and the data as they're
Yeah.
situated under this new regime of digital capitalism? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic question, and it's given me a lot to think about. Over the years, I've sort of approximated this from a number of different perspectives. I think one thing to say is that one of the things that characterizes the digital economy is the separation between the map and the data, and the different copyright regime. One of the things that I've written about is how the different intellectual property regimes and the copyright that rules over the visual or pictorial component of maps, let's say, does not constrain databases. And so that has really been characteristic of how the data has acquired a lot more, let's say, economic value in much of the digital economy. And many of the maps in and of themselves are, let's say, just the expressions of different data that are queried, that are analyzed, etc. But I don't think that's sufficient. One of the things that I come back to in terms of maps is that there's more to them than just the expression of the data, but rather they also become ways for us to navigate these economic landscapes that are sort of given to us by our interaction with digital environments. So, for example, just the way that maps can be made and remade kind of on demand, depending on our location, depending on where we're navigating, our prior interests, our history, what the algorithms things were like, that provides a different experience of space, which in turn may lead to different economic relations just by virtue of like the things that are shown to you on the map. And so those processes of abstraction, selection, generalization are kind of done on the fly for you behind the scenes. And there's a process of customization, right? That then can lead to us discovering different things or interacting with different shops, restaurants, people, let's say, features in our environment in different ways. And then lastly, in many ways, the maps are central to the provision of certain services. Like if we think about the mediation that the Uber or Lyft or some ride hailing app does, is really how we understand that service and how those spatial relations are made legible to us, right? And so there's an implicit trust that is placed in the map, um, for us to think that somebody is near or far, or that information that a lot might be going on behind the scenes, but is communicated to us in terms of the provision of that service via the map. And so in the book, I rely on the idea by this Argentinian anthropologist. His name is Juan del Nido. He calls it like uh, a cartographic, I believe, phantasmagoria. So it's kind of an illusion that it seems very ordered, very orderly, that organizes the chaotic space around us and sort of smooths the rough edges of the sort of chaotic navigation of the city and gives us only what we need to sort of wait and trust that the driver is coming to get you, and that you're going to get the promised rate, and that you're going to arrive at your destination at the promised time. So that's, I think, kind of three different versions of where the maps are still providing a lot and are doing much more than just being sort of the output, the cartographic output of these valuation processes that take place behind the scenes.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. We have a question from the chat that I want to highlight for you. John asks, isn't the success of Uber, etc., based on the courts to not consider it to be a taxi? Which I think is a really great observation around some of the sort of legal frameworks in which these digital technologies get regulated, constrained, are made permissible, legal or illegal. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the places that you see legal challenges emerging around digital spatial technologies and locational data, maybe in the spirit of ride sharing in particular, per John's comment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would agree with John 100% there, in saying that the legal dimension has been absolutely crucial. I don't think it's sufficient, but it has been absolutely a necessary aspect of how Uber has been able to expand. And just to shout out the book Disrupting DC by Katie Wells, Declan Cullen, and Kafui Atto, it's an amazing documentation of how they did this in DC. And this is through, yes, the courts, but then also the sort of co-optation of the entire sort of governance apparatus of the city, and really pitching and lobbying Uber as the solution to a lot of the city's transportation problems. So there's, of course, the labor issue, where the misclassification of contractors so that they don't get have the same rights as workers has allowed Uber and other ride-hailing companies to not pay many of the benefits that could be owed to these workers. Of course, there's battles about this in California and the UK and other places, but it has been a really important part of the playbook. As Juan Del Nido documents in the case of Buenos Aires in his book Uber versus Taxis, or Taxis versus Uber, it was also really salient how, as in Paris and in other places, Uber just kind of rolled into town, knowingly breaking a lot of the existing laws, but with the buy-in of many of the, let's say, local elites, or business classes, or even middle classes, who were very dissatisfied with the local taxi economies. So that's why I say it's not a sufficient factor, because there was also the existing frictions with the taxi economy in many parts of the world created this opportunity for Uber, right? And as in the book documenting the DC experience, it was how Uber leveraged that with the kind of power of the courts and the lobbying influence to position themselves as the solution, one of many possible solutions that we could have, such as like better funding for public transportation, or better taxis, etc. But this became the de facto solution for every city's transportation woes. So that's why it became the playbook that they sort of repeated over and over. And yeah, we've seen some challenges, but I think by and large they have basically gotten away with it, pretty well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Luis. It even, to my mind, hooks back into some important points that you made during this talk around the geopolitical order, and what these tools are reinforcing versus what they're disrupting. All of which is really sort of animated through legal, political, technological debates over these ride-sharing firms. I have another question, and then we might have time for one more if someone else wants to drop one in the chat before we start to wrap up. The Map and the Machine is a story that you're telling about digital capitalism. And there are a lot of ways to define capitalism. I'm going to toss out a pithy one, the art of using money to make more money. Maybe we can use that I think that's David Graeber's term. Maybe we can use that as a starting point. In digital capitalism, based on some of these locational data-driven changes that you're seeing, how are people making money differently? How do companies, for example, that are leveraging some of these new techniques, this new locational data, how are people making money in a different way under this? Or is it this reimagining of space, as you say, more of a new flavor of the same old stuff and processes in a sort of technological outfit?
Yeah. So this, I go back and forth with this, because there are some really qualitative changes that are happening here, but sometimes they take a while to really show. And I think one thing we can say is that people are making money, but it's not the same people as before, and often even those people don't make money for a long time. So Uber was not profitable for like the first 10 years. And so this is like a lot of what goes behind digital capitalism is a money losing operation, depending on where the cutoff point is. And so this is just like an artifact of a lot of investment and a lot of strategies premised on growth rather than profitability. So, I mean, I guess there's the eventual promise of profitability, but many don't even get there. So it's true that there's a lot of money lost everywhere. Now, I think that on the other hand, there's always the shadow of monopoly. So because there's the idea of just growing at any rate and getting rid of the competition, the eventual sort of the end stage, the end game of a lot of digital capitalism is monopoly markets, right? And this is what we're seeing in, well, with the new antitrust fights against Amazon and Google and, you know, Uber and so many others who are sort of premised on growing against existing regulation, kind of in some cases playing dirty, in some cases doing whatever it takes, losing a lot of money, just to sort of race to the bottom to get rid of the competition. So eventually, some are making money. There are other ways in which others are making money, and they're kind of transforming existing structures. So Netflix is another one that I go back to because it really, sort of swallowed the industry that sort of gave rise to it in many ways. And so another thing that I've been looking into now is the sort of the relative balance of power between in what is the AMPTP, so the American Motion Television Picture Association, Producers Association, and so this really is now essentially a tech industry organization where like Netflix and Amazon and Apple are calling the shots, right? And so one of the important aspects that Netflix brought in, it's not the only aspect, but is right, like really leveraging location to uh, market their product globally. And so this is something that the motion picture industry had done for a long time with like windowed releases and DVD regions and other things, but Netflix does it at the drop of a hat. And so Netflix is making a lot of money. Of course, many of the other companies that tried it, and this is where we can go back into something like the streaming wars, are losing money hand over fist. And so this is again a strategy that is kind of premised on relentless growth, and eventually, like in Highlander, only one will survive.
Well, on that cheery note, in the shadow of monopoly, we are very close to 7:30 here. Is there anything? Maybe we can end on a reminder that you can get Luis's book at a link that my colleague Kiana will drop in the chat. Luis, I want to say thank you one more time for joining us for this program tonight. It's been a pleasure to host you here at the Map Center. Before we shut down here, I want to give everyone a quick reminder of two upcoming events that are also programmed around the same theme of processing place. If you were interested in this talk, if you're interested in these histories of geographic information systems and digital mapping, we have two things on the schedule here at the Leventhal Center that ought to pique your interest. This Thursday, on January 16th, Emily Bowe and I will be giving a talk at the Washington Map Society, a look behind processing place, sort of curatorial reflection on pulling the show together. It's a virtual program. Would love for anyone to sign up. On February 5th, we will be hosting a panel of state employees, city employees who work in a variety of ways with urban sensors, collecting urban sensor data through environmental technologies. This will be in person at 6 p.m. at the Leventhal Center in person. I think that's all I have for you. Luis, do you have any final words before we wrap?
No, just go and see the exhibit. It's I'm very thrilled to be a part of it, and again, it's an honor to return to the Leventhal programming. So thank you again for this opportunity, and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, Luis. It's always great to see you.
Likewise.
Take care, folks. We will see you next time.